either, come closer to the fire for a moment, because this old story begins with a city that may not have been punished so much as sealed away. I have always found it strange that the tale of Sodom is usually told like a simple warning in Sunday school colors. Wicked people, burning sky, lesson learned, close the book. But when you stand near the Dead Sea in your mind, when you imagine that pale water lying far below the living world, so dense with salt that it feels less like a lake and more like a wound that never closed, the story becomes quieter and much more troubling. The land itself seems to be remembering something. A valley once described as green, watered, generous, almost like a garden, became one of the lowest and most lifeless places on the exposed earth. Ancient trade records appear to whisper names that sound like the cities of the plain. Sodom, Gomorrah, Adma, Zeboim, Zoar. Some scholars argue over those names, and they are right to be careful. Clay can be patient, but it can also be ambiguous. Still, the pattern is hard to ignore. Cities trading, cities flourishing, cities written into the ordinary paperwork of a vanished age. And then, silence. That is the small door we are opening tonight. If you enjoy slow stories like this, stories where old ruins, strange texts, and dark questions are handled gently by candlelight, go ahead and like this video and subscribe. It helps keep the fire lit for the next journey. Now settle in, not too formally, just enough to let the room grow softer. Let your shoulders drop if they want to. The night does not need anything from you. The story will move slowly. Picture first, not the burning city, not yet, but a basement archive in Rome. Not a grand chamber with gold ceilings and marble saints gazing down from painted clouds. This is a quieter place, more practical, almost plain. Metal shelving stands in careful rows. The lights above are pale and steady. Somewhere behind a wall, a climate control system breathes in a patient mechanical rhythm, as if the building itself is sleeping lightly, guarding things older than almost every empire we can name. On the table before you are photographs, plaster casts, pages of notes, translations marked and revised by hands that have learned to read the language of clay. Most of the tablets are ordinary, and that is what makes them powerful. They are not glowing prophecies. They are not poems about monsters. They are records. Grain, sheep, cloth, silver, lists of goods, lists of places, names of officials, messengers, merchants, debts, taxes, deliveries. The ancient world, it turns out, had paperwork too. Somewhere in the Bronze Age, someone was probably sighing over inventory the way we sigh over email. That thought comforts me a little. Even in deep time, somebody had to count the goats. But among those ordinary records, there are names that made certain readers pause. A city called Sidamu, another called Imara, another called Admanu, another called Sebim, another called Ba, or a name close to Bela. The proposed echoes are difficult not to hear. Sidamu, Sodom, Imara, Gomorrah, Edma. Manu, Adma, Sabim, Zeboim, Bela. The city also remembered as Zoar. The 5 cities of the plain. We should be gentle here. We cannot slam the table and say the case is closed. Some scholars dispute the identifications. They say the sounds may be similar by accident, that ancient names can deceive the ear, that the geography is uncertain, that a name preserved in one archive need not be the name we want it to be. They may be right. Scholarship is a room full of careful lamps, not a bonfire. And yet, the possibility remains. If these names are what they seem to be, then Sodom was not born only from sermon and symbol. It had weight. It had streets. It had gates. It had merchants who counted goods, women who carried water, children who watched dust rise under donkey hooves, elders who argued over prices, servants who swept thresholds before dawn. It belonged to a network of trade and hunger and ambition. It existed in the daily world of clay seals and grain jars. That changes the feeling of the story. A legend can be dismissed as mist. A city in a trade record is harder to brush aside. It stands there quietly, president holding a receipt. So before we ever reach the fire falling from heaven, we begin with the hush of administration. The dull little facts. A name in a ledger. A delivery recorded. A city mentioned as if it would always be there. Then later, the names stop. Sometimes silence is louder than a scream. And somewhere in those records, the cities of the plain seem to breathe once, twice, and vanish. Now let the room shift. Leave the archive for a moment. Let the metal shelves fade into candle smoke. Let the fluorescent hum become the soft crackle of the fire beside us. We are moving farther back, into the story most people know, though perhaps not as well as they think. There is a man named Abraham sitting by the oaks of Mamre. The day is warm. The light has that heavy desert brightness that makes the edges of things tremble. His tent cloth stirs in a dry wind. Somewhere nearby, animals chew slowly, and a servant moves quietly with a bowl. Abraham looks up, and 3 figures are standing near him. Then the tone changes. The visitors speak of Sodom and Gomorrah. The outcry against them is great. Their sin is very grave. The words are simple, but they fall with weight. Somewhere below, in the watered plain, a city has become a cry rising upward. Abraham knows that his nephew Lot lives there. So he begins to bargain. And honestly, I have always loved this scene because it is so human. He does not thunder. He does not pretend to know better than heaven. He does what any frightened uncle might do. He starts counting. What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? The answer comes. The city will be spared. What if there are 45? Spared. Forte. Spared. 30. Spared. 20. Spared. 10. Even for 10, the city would not be destroyed. Then Abraham stops. The shrinking numbers hang in the air like beads sliding down a string. 50, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. He does not ask about 9. He does not ask about 5. The story leaves that question untouched. And untouched things can glow in the dark. There were not 10. The 2 visitors who go down toward Sodom arrive near evening. Imagine that descent slowly. The hills above the Jordan plain cooling as the sun lowers. Stone under sandals. Dust gathering in the hem of a robe. The valley opening below them, green in the memory of the text, rich with water, a place that once looked almost like Eden from a distance. The city waits there, not yet burning, not yet ash, still full of ovens and voices, bargaining and laughter, doors closing, animals being led inside for the night. Lot is sitting in the gate. When he sees the visitors, he rises quickly. He bows. He urges them not to spend the night in the square. "Come to my house," he says in effect. "Wash your feet. Rest. Rise early and go on your way." There is urgency beneath the manners. You know that feeling when someone smiles too politely because they are trying not to show fear? That is how I hear Lot in this scene. He knows the city. He knows what happens to strangers after dark. He knows the public square is not safe, and perhaps he knows far more than he wants to say. The visitors first say no. They will stay outside. Lot insists. At last, they enter his house. A meal is made. Unleavened bread is baked. The door closes. Outside, night gathers. The story says the men of Sodom surround the house, young and old, from every quarter. The whole city presses toward one door. That detail is strange. It does not feel like a sudden drunken crowd. It feels organized. It feels almost ceremonial. A city that can mobilize itself against 2 strangers has done this before, or something like it. They call out to Lot, "Bring them out, that we may know them." That word, know, has carried centuries of interpretation on its back. In Hebrew, the word is yada. It can mean ordinary knowledge. It can mean recognition. It can mean intimate knowledge. It can mean to examine, to become acquainted with, to understand by contact. Context gives it shape. Later readers often made it simple, too simple perhaps. They made the sin of Sodom a narrow thing, a single category of desire, and built heavy judgments upon that reading. But the Bible itself is not so narrow when it remembers Sodom. The prophet Ezekiel, writing in another age, says the guilt of Sodom was pride, too much food, prosperous ease, and failure to aid the poor and needy. That is a very different mirror. It shows a rich city grown hard, full of bread, empty of mercy. Then the letter of Jude speaks of strange flesh, flesh of another kind. That phrase has always sounded like a cold draft under the door. If the issue were only ordinary human wickedness, why use such language? Why strange flesh? Why other flesh? The source of this story leads us toward a darker possibility. Not certain, not proven, but old enough to make the room feel colder. The chapter of Sodom stands not far from another troubling memory, the story of the sons of God and the daughters of men, the Watchers in later tradition, the beings who crossed a boundary between heaven and earth and produced the Nephilim, mighty ones, giant, figures of renown. Ancient interpreters often understood that story as a mingling that should never have happened, a corruption not only of behavior, but of kind, divine and human, heaven and soil, mixed in a way that broke the order of creation. If that is the background, then the scene at Lot Door becomes stranger. The men of Sodom may not simply want to harm strangers. They may recognize that the visitors are not ordinary men. They may want to know them in the deepest, most dangerous sense, to seize, to examine, to possess what is other. That is the reading the source invites us to consider, gently, uneasily, as one might lift a cloth from something hidden on a table. And if that is true, then the destruction that follows begins to look less like anger and more like containment. A disease is not debated with. A fire spreading through dry grass is not given a lecture. A contamination that threatens the whole field is cut off, sealed, burned at the edge before it can take root everywhere. That is a hard thought, so let us hold it softly. Inside the house, the lamps tremble. Lot stands at the door. The crowd presses closer. The visitors remain calm, perhaps terribly calm. They have come to see whether the cry against the city is true. The city, in gathering itself around them, answers. And above the plain, in the dark, beyond the rooftops, the stars keep their places. For now, nothing has fallen. For now, the city still breathes. But the old story has already turned its face toward morning, and morning will not arrive gently. Morning in the old story does not arrive like morning usually does. There is no gentle rooster calling from a roof, no woman laughing beside a water jar, no child rubbing sleep from his eyes while smoke begins to rise from the first cooking fires. The dawn over Sodom comes with urgency, with hands pulling at sleeves, with feet searching for sandals in the dark, with voices kept low because the city outside is still breathing, and no one wants to wake it too soon. The visitors tell Lot to rise. Take your wife. Take your daughters. Leave this place. Even then, he hesitates. I have always found that small delay painfully believable. We like to imagine that if an angel told us to run, we would run at once, graceful and obedient, perhaps even looking good while doing it. But human beings are sticky creatures. We cling to door frames. We remember where the cups are kept. We think of unfinished conversations, buried coins, a neighbor who once lent us oil, a tree planted near the wall, a bed that still holds the warmth of sleep. Even in danger, the familiar can put its hands around our ankles. Lot hesitates, and the visitors take him by the hand. That gesture softens the scene. For all the terror around it, there is mercy in that touch. A hand on Lot, a hand on his wife, a hand on each daughter. The family is drawn out of the city as if pulled from a dream that has already begun to burn at the edges. The instruction is simple. Escape for your life. Do not look behind you. Do not stay in the plain. Flee to the mountains. Do not look back. Those words have followed the story for thousands of years. They sound moral, and perhaps they are. Do not long for the place that almost swallowed you. Do not turn your heart toward what must end. But in the darker reading of this tale, the warning may be more physical than poetic. Do not expose your face. Do not let your eyes meet the brightness. Do not turn your body toward whatever is about to descend. Lot asks for a smaller mercy. Not the mountains. He says, not so far. Let me flee to a little city nearby. Zoar. Small enough to survive. Perhaps small enough to be spared. Again, the story makes the disaster feel deliberate. The visitors do not speak like people watching weather approach. They speak as though timing matters, as though the event can wait until the chosen survivors are beyond its reach. That is one of the strange seams in the old account. If this were only a random accident, a stone from the sky, arriving blind and indifferent. Why does the story remember instruction, negotiation, delay, permission? We cannot be sure what memory lies under the words. We can only listen. So Lot runs. His wife runs. His daughters run. The plain opens around them in the thin light before sunrise. Perhaps there is dew on the low plants. Perhaps the river breathes its coolness across the ground. Perhaps, for one last moment, the valley still looks like what Genesis once called it, well-watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. You can almost see it as Lot once saw it from the heights with Abraham, a shining place, a place of green promise, a place where a practical man might think, yes, there, my flocks will live, my household will grow, my future will be easier. Then the sky changes. The text says, fire and brimstone came from heaven. Brimstone means sulfur, that yellow mineral with a sharp breath and a flame that can burn with a ghostly blue. Fire is simple enough, until it is not simple at all. The story does not describe an army with torches. It does not describe siege engines, raiders, or a palace coup. It looks upward. The fire comes from above. Try to imagine it softly, because there is no need to make it loud. A brightening behind the clouds. A pressure in the air. A white light touching the roofs before sound catches up. Birds lifting all at once from reeds near the water, then vanishing into glare. The surface of jars heating faster than hands can understand. The city, so certain of itself, suddenly smaller than a spark. The account says the cities were overthrown. That word matters. It does not only mean burned. It means turned over, reversed, transformed, as if a bowl had been flipped and everything inside spilled into another state. Sodom, Gomorrah, the plain, the people, the growing things, all of it is included in the sweep of the sentence. Not one house, not one palace, not merely a wicked district. The plain itself is changed. The text lingers on totality. What grew from the ground is gone. The landscape itself is harmed. Later memory places the event beside a sea that kills rather than feeds, a valley crusted white, a region where the air shimmers and the land seems to have forgotten how to welcome life. And then there is Lot wife. She looks back. The story says she becomes a pillar of salt. We must tread gently around that image. It has often been used as a clean little lesson about disobedience, and perhaps that lesson is part of it. But the image itself is too strange to leave untouched. A woman turns, and the living body becomes mineral. Flesh becomes a standing column. Movement becomes geology. A person becomes part of the dead landscape. Ordinary fire does not do that. Fire chars. Fire consumes. Fire leaves ash, bone, smoke. It does not calmly turn a human being into salt. So interpreters have offered many explanations. Some say it is symbolic. Some imagine salt crusts forming around a body. Some point to the strange formations near the Dead Sea, pillars and ridges that can look almost human in low light. All of that may be worth considering. Do not look back. Perhaps the warning was mercy. She turns, and the story leaves her there. A white figure. A pause in the landscape. A memory that cannot walk any farther. Lot and his daughters keep moving. Behind them, the cities vanish into heat, smoke, sound, and silence. Because the next question is not what fell, but what remained. The Dead Sea sits in the Jordan Rift Valley, a deep wound in the earth, where the land falls far below the level of the open ocean. It is the lowest exposed place on dry land. Water flows down into it, but has no easy road out. The sun takes the water away by evaporation, and what is left behind grows heavier and heavier with minerals. Salt gathers. Bitterness gathers. The lake becomes dense, shining, almost oily, until the body floats on it like a leaf on a dark thought. Nothing like an ordinary sea lives there. No silver fish turning in schools. No soft green plants moving under the surface. No generous freshwater smell. The water is too heavy with salt. It draws moisture from living cells. It preserves and punishes at the same time. And this is what makes the story ache. Genesis remembers that before the disaster, the region looked different. Lot saw the plain of the Jordan and chose it because it was well watered everywhere. The comparison is lush, almost extravagant. Like the garden of the Lord. Like Egypt. Those are not dry words. They are words of abundance. Water, fields, channels, palms, shade, grain, animals, mud dark with fertility. A land where life does not merely survive, but leans forward. The Dead Sea region, as later memory holds it, is the opposite of that promise. Something transformed the image. Still, the story binds the transformation to catastrophe. It says the cities were there. It says the plain was rich. It says fire came from heaven. It says the ground and what grew upon it were struck. It says a woman became salt. It says the place afterward was remembered as cursed. The source we are following asks whether this was punishment at all, at least in the simple sense. Punishment tries to correct. Punishment leaves open the possibility that the guilty may learn, repent, rebuild, return. But the destruction of Sodom, as remembered here, leaves no such room. The city is not disciplined. It is removed. The plain is not warned. It is altered. The ground itself is made inhospitable to continuation. That sounds less like a courtroom and more like containment. Now, picture the valley after. The first day after fire. Smoke thinning. The light strange, filtered through dust. No market voices. No animals calling from pens. No sandals slapping through alleys. Walls collapsed into shapes that no longer resemble human intention. Yards broken open, their contents fused with earth. The soil warm in places where it should be cool. A taste in the air like struck stone and bitter minerals. No one comes to rebuild. That detail matters. Human beings rebuild almost anything. We return after floods. We return after earthquakes. We return after wars, carrying babies, boards, seeds, stubbornness. We camp beside ruins and call them foundations. But in the memory around Sodom, the wound does not become a city again. The plain does not simply recover after a season of rain. The story of destruction fuses with the story of lasting desolation. And so the question waits. What could make a fertile valley become a warning? What could make a city disappear so completely that later ages argued whether it had ever existed at all? What could turn water into a symbol of death and salt into the signature of judgment, memory, and preservation? Honestly, I do not think the most interesting question is whether they used our vocabulary. The more interesting question is why their memory was so precise in mood. A city guilty beyond ordinary words. Visitors from outside the human order. A warning to flee before dawn. Fire from above. Sulfur. Salt. The plain overturned. A woman fixed forever as mineral. A land that does not heal. And somewhere beneath that dream, perhaps, is a real event. The Ebla records. If the debated identifications are accepted, offer one kind of whisper. The geography offers another. The biblical narrative offers another. None of them alone forces certainty. Together, they create a hush. A hush like the moment before a door opens. That is why the tale endures. Not because it is simple, because it refuses to become simple. It begins as a moral warning, then becomes a historical puzzle. It becomes a geological memory. It becomes a theological argument. It becomes a strange echo of another forbidden story. The Watchers and the Nephilim and the crossing of lines between kinds. It becomes a question about whether some places are destroyed because they are wicked, or because they are dangerous. A wicked city might be conquered. A dangerous city might be erased. Outside our little room of candlelight, the night is deep now. Inside the story, the smoke still rises from the plain. Lad is somewhere beyond the worst of it, breathing hard, unable to understand what survival has cost him. His daughters are near him. His wife is behind him, no longer walking. The cities are gone. But the land remains. And in the land, the question remains too. Why so complete? Why the water? Why the salt? Why the command not to look? Why the silence afterward? The old story does not answer in a hurry. It waits, like clay hardening after the hand has left it. It waits for us to move from words into earth, from scripture into excavation, from the fire described by ancient voices into the strange black layer that modern hands would one day uncover beneath the dust. So let the last image be very quiet. A plain under morning light. No city sounds. No bargaining at the gate. No footsteps except those of the survivors moving away. Behind them, where towers and roofs once stood, the air glimmers. White crystals begin to form along broken stones. The river keeps flowing downward, carrying minerals, memory, and silence into a basin with no door to the sea. The story is not finished. It has only become deeper. Now let the smoke thin, and let the story sink down through the soil. For a long while, all we have are words. Ancient words. Careful words. Frightening words made soft by distance. Fire from heaven. Brimstone. Cities overturned. A plane changed. A woman becoming salt. These phrases pass from tongue to tongue until they almost become familiar. But earth has its own memory. It waits under wind and goat tracks and collapsed walls. It holds ash in a layer no thicker than a hand. It keeps fragments of pottery where they fell. It keeps heat in glass. It keeps the quiet signature of a day when ordinary life stopped. So now, if you were standing here with me, we would leave the scrolls behind for a little while. We would step out from the candlelit room of old scripture and walk into the patient world of archaeology. The air would feel drier here. The light would be flatter. Dust would cling to the skin, not rudely, just insistently, like a thought that refuses to leave. In the southern Jordan Valley, northeast of the Dead Sea, there is a site known today as Tal el-Hammam. The name feels simple in the mouth, but the place beneath it is not simple at all. It rises from the plain as a mound made by human time, layer upon layer of living, building, repairing, forgetting, returning. Ancient cities rarely disappear all at once from the earth. They sink. One house falls. Another is built over it. One wall crumbles. Another wall follows its old line. Floors become foundations. Streets become buried seams. A city becomes a hill made of its own memory. Tal el-Hammam was not small. The excavators who worked there found a great Bronze Age city, large enough to make nearby settlements seem modest by comparison. It was a place of walls, gates, towers, rooms, storage, craft, and command. A city placed where a city would want to be placed. In the watered plain, near routes of travel, near the wealth that moves between regions when merchants trust the roads enough to use them. For centuries, people lived there. Try to let that sentence become large. For centuries, fires were lit in houses. Bread was baked. Jars were filled. Children grew into elders. Names were spoken, forgotten, and replaced. Someone repaired a wall after rain. Someone swept a courtyard before a guest arrived. Someone counted grain. Someone worried about a debt. Someone laughed too loudly at a gate and was told to be quiet. Life did what life does. It filled the available space with breath and habit. Then, around the middle of the second millennium before the Common Era, according to the interpretation followed by the source, something happened. Not a slow fading, not a city losing trade over generations, not a drought that pushed families away one season at a time. A sudden ending. Archaeologists often learn to read endings. A city abandoned slowly has a certain feel. Valuables are removed. Doors are left open. Roofs collapse in stages. Dust settles with patience. But a city struck suddenly leaves a different kind of sentence in the ground. It leaves objects where hands last used them. It leaves rooms interrupted. It leaves destruction that does not politely arrange itself. At Tal el-Hammam, the destruction layer drew attention because it was strange. Pottery appeared melted in ways that ordinary house fire could not easily explain. Clay surfaces seemed to have been heated beyond the range of common burning. Mud brick bore signs of vitrification, that beautiful and terrible word meaning that something earthy had been pushed toward glass. Tiny, glassy particles were found. Little beads and fragments formed under heat so intense that soil itself seemed to have forgotten it was soil. Imagine holding a shard in your palm. On one side, it is humble pottery, the kind of thing made by hands that knew clay, water, pressure, sun, kiln, use. On the other side, there is a sheen, a skin, a hard shine left by an instant of heat too fierce for the old world to name. The shard is small. The implication is not. Some researchers argued that the site had been struck by a cosmic airburst, an object from space entering the atmosphere and exploding above the ground rather than making a crater. Such events are known in modern times. They can release extraordinary energy. They can flatten forests, shatter windows across wide regions, and create heat and pressure far beyond ordinary fire. In the proposed model, a blast over or near the Dead Sea region could have generated the temperatures needed to melt and vitrify material, while throwing salt and mineral-rich matter across the plain. Again, we should be careful. The interpretation is debated. Some scholars accept parts of the evidence and question the conclusions. Some challenge the identification of the site with Sodom. Some are wary of connecting archaeology too quickly with Scripture. That caution is healthy. The past deserves careful hands. It has been injured often enough by people who wanted it to prove too much. Still, the evidence described in the source is haunting. Melted surfaces, glassy material, shocked minerals, unusual traces associated with extreme pressure and heat, salt in the destruction layer, a city ending abruptly, a long period of abandonment after the event. The ancient account speaks of fire from above and a poisoned plain. The ground appears to preserve a memory of heat from above and salt spread through the earth. It is not proof in the simple, a satisfying way we sometimes want proof to be. It is not a sealed envelope from the Bronze Age reading. Yes, this was Sodom. Please stop arguing. The past is not that generous, and honestly, it would be less interesting if it were. Instead, it gives fragments. It gives a blackened line in the soil. It gives a shard with a glassy face. It gives silence after a long occupation. The mind begins to place these fragments beside the story. A city in the plain. A sudden destruction. Heat beyond ordinary burning. Salt. A silence that lasts. And the room grows still. Layer by layer, the mound is opened. Here, a wall. Here, a floor. Here, ash. Here, pottery. Here, something that should not quite be there. Above them, if the airburst theory is right, something enters the sky. Not slowly enough to be understood. Not kindly enough to be avoided. A body from beyond human weather, burning as it meets the air, breaking, brightening, releasing in a breath what cities could not release in centuries. If it burst above the plain, the light would have arrived first, then heat, then force, then the terrible rearrangement of everything that had seemed solid. But the ancient text remembers agency. That is where the source grows stranger, and we must follow it without pretending certainty. In the story, the destruction is not described as random. Abraham bargains before it happens. The visitors inspect the city. Lot is warned. He is told to flee. He is told not to look back. The messengers say they cannot do anything until he is safely away. The sequence feels deliberate. It feels timed. A meteor does not usually wait for a family. A comet fragment does not bargain over 10 righteous people. Of course, memory can arrange disaster into meaning afterward. Survivors often build stories around the unbearable, because the mind cannot easily live beside meaningless ruin. A village is destroyed by flood, and later generations say the river was angry. A mountain erupts, and people say the gods spoke. Trauma becomes narrative. Narrative becomes teaching. Teaching becomes sacred memory. That may be all that happened. A random cosmic event struck a wealthy city. Survivors remembered warnings, guilt, mercy, judgment. The story became shaped by theology over generations. The disaster became moral because human beings need suffering to mean something. That explanation is possible. It may even be likely to many careful minds. But the source asks us to sit with another possibility, one the ancient world would not have found absurd. What if the event was not random? What if the fire from above was not only a falling object, but a directed act? What if the cosmic force was somehow aimed, called, permitted, released? What if what modern researchers describe as an airburst and what ancient narrators describe as divine fire are not enemies, but two languages touching the same wound from opposite sides? There is a kind of humility in not choosing too quickly. The old scribes did not know the language of atmospheric explosions, pressure, thermal force, and shock waves. Modern researchers do not usually speak of angels. outcry, and divine investigation. But both stand beside the same plane. Both look at the same scar. Both say, something happened here. Tonight, the mystery can simply breathe. So let us return to the Dead Sea after the blast, in the slow years after, when the first horror had become landscape. Wind moved across broken ground. Rain came and did not heal enough. Salt lay in the soil. Fields that had once been generous no longer answered the hand. A city can endure a failed harvest, but land that refuses generation after generation teaches people to leave it alone. The silence after a catastrophe can last longer than the sound. Perhaps travelers came near and turned away. Perhaps stories settled around the place like dust. Do not go down into that plain. Once there were cities there. Once there were gates. Once there was wealth. Then fire came down. Over time, the story hardened into memory. Sodom became a name people used when they wanted to speak of pride, cruelty, corruption, danger, violation, excess, and the dreadful moment when heaven no longer delays. But beneath all those meanings, the ground kept its quieter archive. No sermon can melt pottery. No metaphor vitrifies brick. No moral lesson alone fills a layer with strange glass. The archaeologist brushes. The shard appears. The old question returns. What force reached down into the plain? What force turned the city from a place into a warning? What force left salt where life had been? And somewhere between them, the lost city waits, not asking us to solve it all at once, only to listen. A real city, a real destruction, a real silence afterward. And beyond that, the darker question the source keeps pressing gently into our hands. If the destruction was real, then what was happening in Sodom that made erasure feel necessary? Not defeat, not warning, not exile. Erasure. That is where the story must go next, past the burned lair and into the older fear, the fear of strange flesh, forbidden knowledge, and the boundary between what belongs to earth and what should never have come down into it. The older fear begins before Sodom, at least in the way the source asks us to hear the story. It begins in the strange doorway of Genesis, where the world before the flood is remembered as crowded with forces that do not fit neatly inside the human. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, the text says, and took wives from among them. From those unions came the Nephilim, the mighty ones of old. Figures of renown, beings whose names seem to echo from a time when the borders between heaven and earth were not treated as walls, but as doors that could be opened wrongly. That little passage has troubled readers for a very long time. Some interpreters explain the sons of God in human terms. Others, especially many ancient readers, heard something stranger, divine or angelic beings crossing into human life and producing offspring that should not have existed. The source follows that older, darker reading, not as settled fact, but as a tradition that makes Sodom feel much less simple. The Book of Enoch gives this tradition a fuller shape. It speaks of watchers, beings who descended to earth and taught humanity things that arrived too early, or arrived from the wrong hands. They taught metalwork, weapons, ornaments, the beautifying of the eyes, the reading of stars, the signs of heaven, the cutting of roots, the secrets of plants. At first glance, some of this sounds almost harmless. A little astronomy, a little craft, a little medicine. Humanity has always learned by touching the world and seeing what answers. But forbidden knowledge is rarely frightening because one tool exists alone. It is frightening because tools gather. A blade in one hand, a chart of the stars in another, a root cut open, a lineage studied, a body adorned, altered, made to seem like something more than itself. A little knowledge of metals, a little knowledge of timing, a little knowledge of desire, a little knowledge of how living things pass themselves into the future. The source wonders if the old phrase, the cutting of roots, may carry a shadow deeper than herbs. Perhaps it meant plants and medicine. Yet, in a story about bloodlines and forbidden unions, roots may also suggest origins, families, descent, the hidden threads from which living forms rise. We have to move softly here. It is easy to make ancient texts say more than they say. The old scribes did not use our language of biology or manipulation of life. They lived in a world of seed, blood, blessing, curse, kinship, and kind. Yet those words are not simple. Kind can mean a boundary that must not be crossed. The source reads the corruption before the flood in that light. When Genesis says that all flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth, the phrase is larger than a list of bad choices. All flesh, not only cities, not only kings, not only the violent, flesh itself, the living order, the pattern by which creatures remain what they were made to be. In this reading, the flood is not only punishment, it is cleansing, a reset, a drowning of corruption that had entered too deeply into the world. And then comes the troubling afterthought. If the flood ended it, why do the giants return? Why do later texts speak again of Nephilim, Anakim, Rephaim, Emim, Zamzumim, clans of unusual terror and size, peoples that make ordinary men feel like grasshoppers? Why do some territories in the biblical story seem marked not merely for conquest, but for complete removal? Why do certain names cling to certain valleys like old smoke? That is the dark thread the source follows back to Sodom. Perhaps the cities of the plain were not only cruel, though the traditions say they were cruel. Perhaps beneath pride, wealth, and hardness toward the poor, there was another practice, another inheritance, another secret preserved from the world before the flood. The Book of Jasher, outside the biblical canon, but remembered in biblical references as a known work, paints Sodom as a place where cruelty had become organized. In its stories, strangers were not merely disliked. They were processed. The city had learned to make injustice official, which is always more chilling than a single cruel person. One cruel person is a wolf at the edge of the firelight. A cruel system is the forest itself leaning in. There is an old motif in those traditions of a bed used against strangers. If a guest was too short, he was stretched. If too long, he was cut down to fit. We will keep the image soft, because the meaning is enough. Sodom forced the living to fit its measure. It did not welcome the stranger. It resized the stranger. That image feels almost like a key, a bed that makes every body fit one cruel pattern, a city that cannot bear what is outside its control, a people that see visitors from another realm and demand to know them. Now return to Lot House in the night. The men of the city stand outside. The old text says they come from every quarter, young and old. The whole male population seems to gather. That is not the shape of a private impulse. It is the shape of a civic response, a practiced response. A city reacting as one body to the arrival of something rare. Bring them out, they say, that we may know them. If the visitors were merely travelers, the scene is already dark enough. But if the visitors were recognized as angelic, as other, as beings from beyond the human order, the demand deepens. It becomes not only violence, but acquisition. They want access. They want contact. They want the strange flesh that Jude remembers in a later phrase. They want what does not belong to them. Lot offers his daughters, and the scene becomes painful and difficult. Many readers recoil from it, and rightly so. Yet, in the source reading, even that terrible offer reveals the nature of the demand. The crowd refuses the substitution. They want the visitors. They want the otherness. In that moment, the angels do not argue. They act. They reach out, pull Lot inside, shut the door, and strike the men outside with blindness. The crowd gropes for the entrance and cannot find it. There is something almost dreamlike about the image. A whole city clawing at a door it can no longer see. Desire without direction. Hunger made helpless. The reconnaissance is complete. That is how the source frames it. The visitors came to see whether the cry against Sodom was true. The city answered with its own mouth. It gathered itself at the door. It revealed what it wanted. It showed that the corruption was not rumor, not exaggeration, not a misunderstanding carried upward on frightened prayers. Then comes the order to leave. This is where the story begins to resemble quarantine rather than trial. In ordinary judgment, the guilty may be named, sentenced, remembered. In quarantine, the priority is containment. Remove what can be saved. Seal what cannot. Prevent spread. Do not look back. Do not remain in the plain. It is a cold logic, and perhaps that is why the story has been softened into a simpler moral lesson. A moral lesson lets us stand outside it comfortably. Quarantine does not. Quarantine asks what the danger was, how it moved, and whether it could hide in families, customs, blood, memory, desire, or seed. The source does not ask us to enjoy that question, only to notice it. Lot himself makes the question harder. He is called righteous in later tradition, yet his life in Sodom is not cleanly separate. He chose the plain because it was rich. He moved toward the city. By the time the angels arrived, he was sitting in the gate, the place of elders, judgment, business, and civic power. That means Lot was not merely a visitor camping outside the walls. He had become woven into the city life. He knew its rules. He knew its dangers. He knew enough to fear for the visitors, but he remained there. That feels human too. Compromise rarely arrives dressed as a monster. It arrives as good pasture, better trade, a safer house, a seat at the gate, one more reason to stay. Lot did not wake one morning and decide to belong to Sodom. He drifted there, step by step, until the city around him felt ordinary. His sons-in-law do not believe the warning. That detail is quietly devastating. Lot goes to them and tells them the city will be destroyed, and they think he is joking. Perhaps they had heard him speak seriously too rarely. Perhaps he had become too much like the city for his warning to sound real. Perhaps they simply could not imagine tomorrow failing to arrive. People almost never can. So Lot leaves with only part of his house. His wife looks back and becomes salt. His daughters survive. Then, after the destruction, the story moves into a cave, and the air changes again. Lot and his daughters believe the world has ended, or at least that no men remain for them. The smoke behind them must have made such fear feel possible. If every road behind you led to ash and salt, you might think the whole earth had been emptied. In that cave, the daughters choose to preserve their father's line. The story is morally uneasy, and we can let it remain uneasy. Out of that cave come Moab and Ammon, ancestors of peoples who will stand in a difficult relationship with Israel for generations. The source hears in this episode another question of lineage. If Sodom was destroyed to stop a corruption, what escaped with the survivors? Or, in a softer possibility, what innocent line was preserved through terrible confusion? We cannot know. The cave is dark. The text does not open every thought. The daughters act from fear, from grief, from the belief that continuity itself is at risk. They do what desperate people have done in many ages. They mistake survival for wisdom. And still, the bloodline continues. This is one of the reasons the Sodom story refuses to become simple. Lot is rescued, but he is not untouched. His daughters survive, but survival carries shadow. The city is erased, yet its aftermath flows into later history. Fire falls, but questions remain alive. That may be the true shape of ancient catastrophe. Not an ending, but a wound that sends roots into time. Outside, the night has grown quiet around our little room. The fire makes small sounds in the grate, and the candle throws one soft circle of light over the table. In that circle, imagine the pieces placed side by side. A clay tablet with a city name, a burned layer in the ground, angels at a door, a woman of salt, a cave where survivors whisper. None of the pieces explains the others completely, yet they lean toward one another. The source asks us to keep looking at the pattern. Not only Sodom, but the other places in the old texts where whole peoples are treated not as enemies to defeat, but as dangers to remove. Not only one burning city, but a wider memory of forbidden lines, giant clone, old names, and the fear that something from before the flood was still moving through the world. For now, let that wider map remain folded. We will open it slowly. The city has burned. Lot has escaped. The daughters carry the future into a cave. The salt wind moves across the plain. And beyond the Dead Sea, in the lands of Canaan, other ancient names are waiting, heavy with the same old dread. The wider map begins with names that feel heavy even before we understand them. Chanaan, Amalek, Anakim, Rephaim, Bashan, Hebron, Jericho. The cities and peoples sit in the old text like stones at the bottom of dark water. We hear them from far away, softened by translation, blurred by centuries of sermons, arguments, maps, and margins. Yet beneath them, the source asks us to notice a pattern that is not comfortable. Some enemies in the ancient story are fought. Some are resisted. Some are warned against. But some are marked for complete removal. That difference matters. It is one thing for a kingdom to lose a battle. It is another for a people to be placed under a command that leaves no room for surrender. Treaty, marriage, ransom, or return. Modern ears recoil from such passages, and they should. A quiet conscience should never become too comfortable with total destruction. Still, if we are listening to the source faithfully, we have to ask why the old text speaks that way at all. What fear was large enough to make elimination sound to its ancient authors? Like protection. The case of Amalek is one of the darkest. The command given to Saul is remembered with terrible completeness. The people are not merely to be defeated. Their animals are included. Their goods are not to be enjoyed as spoils. Nothing is to be folded back into ordinary life. Everything is placed under the ban. That is not the shape of normal war. In Normalva, even ancient war, cattle are useful. Gold is useful. Labor is useful. Captives are useful. The victor takes what can be taken. That is the crude arithmetic of conquest. But here, the arithmetic is rejected. Nothing useful may be used. Nothing living may continue. Nothing contaminated may be brought home and set beside the hearth. This is where the source uses a word that feels chilling in its calmness. Quarantine. Not punishment only. Not revenge only. Quarantine. A thing placed outside the circle so the circle can live. It is a hard thought, and we must hold it carefully, because human beings have used such ideas terribly in history. We are not making a doctrine. We are following a narrative. We are asking what the ancient story believed it was describing. In that story, certain peoples are treated as if the danger is not merely what they do, but what they carry. The 7 nations of Canaan receive a similar treatment. The Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The list moves like a drumbeat. Their practices are condemned. Their altars are condemned. Their influence is feared. Yet the source points out something strange. The same world was full of idolatry, cruelty, divination, child sacrifice, sacred violence, and corrupt kings. Egypt had dark rites. Babylon had idols. Assyria was brutal enough to make stone reliefs out of fear itself. And yet, not every nation is spoken of in the same way. So what made these lands different? The old texts themselves give hints. When the spies enter the land and return to Moses, they do not only report strong walls and armed men, they speak of giants. They say they saw the Nephilim there, the sons of Anak, and that they felt like grasshoppers in their own eyes. It is a strange detail to preserve if the problem is only military strength. There are many ways to describe fear. The text chooses an older word, Nephilim, the word that reaches back toward the world before the flood. A word that should have drowned. The Anakim are named in the hill country. The Rephaim are remembered east of the Jordan and in Bashan. The Emim and Zamzumim appear in territories later linked with Moab and Ammon. Og of Bashan is described as the last of the Rephaim, and the memory of his bed is preserved as something enormous, a relic that seems almost to ask the reader to stop and measure the room. I know, a giant bed can sound like the sort of thing a storyteller adds when the fire is low and the children are leaning in. Ancient people enjoyed dramatic details too. They were human. They exaggerated, teased, frightened, and embroidered. But the persistence of the pattern is the point. Again and again, the peoples marked for extreme treatment are associated with unusual lineages, giant clan, or territories connected with the old corruption. The source is not asking us to imagine a world of fairy tale giants stomping about like clumsy mountains. It is asking something quieter and more troubling. What if the old fear was lineage? What if the danger was inheritance? What if the memory of size, strength, and terror was the visible edge of something the writers understood as a deeper wrong? The Hebrew concept, often translated as the ban, or total devotion to destruction, carries a sacred weight. A city under this ban is not simply conquered. It is removed from normal use. Its objects are not ordinary objects anymore. Its animals are not ordinary animals. Its wealth cannot safely become someone else's wealth. Everything is drawn into the same sealed circle. When Achan takes forbidden spoils from Jericho, the story treats the act not as petty theft, but as contagion. He brings something from the banned place into the camp, and the whole community is endangered. Again, whether one reads this historically, theologically, or mythically, the pattern is unmistakable. Contact matters. Objects matter. Continuation matters. The danger is not only an idea that can be corrected, it behaves like something that spreads. That is why the source returns to Sodom. Sodom is not alone. It sits inside a geography of dread, near the same regions where giant clans are remembered, in a plain later associated with complete and lasting desolation. It is a prosperous city. Yes. A cruel city. Yes. A proud city with bread in its cupboards and no mercy for the hungry. Yes. But the source asks whether it was also a center of something older, something from before the flood, something that had survived in pockets, hidden under wealth, ritual, law, and desire. This is where the story becomes less like a courtroom and more like a map of containment zones. Sodom, burned from above. Jericho, placed under the ban. The hill country, cleared of Anakim. Bashan, remembered as the land of the last Rephaim king. Amalek, ordered into total erasure. Each case is different, and we should not flatten them into one simple formula. But the source hears the same low note beneath them, a fear that certain lines, if allowed to continue, would carry the old corruption forward. The flood was supposed to end that corruption. Yet after the flood, the names return. That is the part that makes the ancient imagination restless. If the waters covered the earth, if the old world was washed away, why do echoes of that old world keep walking through the later story? How does the forbidden come back? Through hidden survivors, through renewed descent, through human imitation of forbidden arts, through bloodlines no one could see until they appeared in strength, cruelty, or strange power. The text never gives one clean mechanism. It only gives the unease. Perhaps that is more honest than a perfect explanation. Ancient fear often survives in fragments. A name here, a command there, a genealogy with a strange note in the margin, a bed too large, a valley no one trusts, a city erased. If you were standing over a candlelit map with me, you could trace the pattern with one finger, from the Dead Sea Plain northward and westward, across territories of clans whose names sound like something muttered in sleep. Rephaim, the shades, or the dead ones, depending on how the word is heard. Anakim, descendants of Anak. Emem, the terrible ones. Zamzumim, a name that seems to buzz even in translation. These are not soft names. They feel like warnings embedded in geography. And then, near the lowest place, Sodom, a city whose sin drew an outcry, a city that tried to know what was not human, a city that could not be spared for 10 righteous people, a city not defeated by an army, but overturned by fire from heaven. The source asks us to notice that Sodom's fate is not proportionate to ordinary vice. If pride alone brought such fire, many cities would have burned every year. If cruelty alone salted the earth, the ancient world would be one long white desert. If sexual sin alone called down that level of erasure, no kingdom would have survived long enough to build walls. So the old story seems to point towards something beyond common wickedness, something existential, something the narrators could only speak around. The idea is disturbing, but the sleep story voice can still carry it gently. Think of a gardener at night, walking with a lantern among orchards after a disease has appeared on one branch. The gardener loves the trees. He knows each trunk, each wound in the bark, each season of fruit. But if one branch is infected beyond saving, he cuts it. If one tree threatens the grove, he burns it outside the wall. This is not hatred of wood. It is grief in the shape of a blade. That may be how the source wants us to imagine the harsher passages, not as anger without measure, as terrible prevention. Yet even that image should make us uneasy, because people are not branches, and ancient stories are not simple manuals. The better way to hold it is this. The texts preserve a fear that the world can be corrupted at its roots, not merely by wrong thoughts, not merely by bad laws. At its roots, in its kinds, in its generations, in the hidden transmission from parent to child, seed to field, blood to blood, memory to memory. The watchers cross a line. The flood comes. The lines survive. Sodom grows rich. The angels descend. The city reveals itself. Fire falls. The pattern is not neat, but it is darkly coherent. And because it is coherent, the source widens the lens beyond Israel. That widening matters. If only one tradition told such a story, we might set it aside as the fearful mythology of one people, shaped by war, land, and memory. But when distant cultures also remember divine or semi-divine beings mingling with humans, giving forbidden knowledge, founding powerful civilizations, and then facing catastrophic correction, the story begins to feel less isolated. It begins to feel like a recurring dream of the human species, a dream of being taught too much too soon, a dream of becoming more than human in the wrong way, a dream of fire, flood, and gods who come down not to comfort, but to stop what has begun. Do not worry. We will not run quickly through those myths. We will move as slowly as footsteps in a museum after closing time. One gallery at a time. One old civilization at a time. Atlantis under its dark water. Mesopotamia under its flood. The Mayan creators clouding the sight of beings who could see too far. Ancient weapons in India that sound to modern ears, uncomfortably like suns brought down to earth. But before we leave Canaan, stay one moment longer with the Dead Sea. The water lies there like a closed eye. Around it, salt glows under moonlight. The ridges look almost like frozen waves. The shore is quiet in that particular way lifeless places can be quiet. Not peaceful, exactly, but emptied. A quiet without insects, without reeds whispering full of birds, without the ordinary small gossip of living things. It is a silence that feels maintained, as if the land is still obeying an old command. No return. No route. No city. Only memory. Mineral. And the question carried forward into every other myth that tells of a boundary crossed, a warning ignored, and a world corrected by catastrophe. Across the old world, the same kind of dream keeps appearing. It changes clothing, language, gos, rivers, mountains, and names, but the shape remains familiar. Beings from above or beyond mingle with human life. Knowledge arrives before its time. A civilization rises quickly, beautifully, dangerously. Pride grows. Boundaries blur. Then the correcting force comes, often by water, often by fire, sometimes by both, and the world after the catastrophe is quieter, smaller, limited again. This does not prove that every myth is the same event. Human beings share fears, and shared fears can make similar stories. We fear the sea rising. We fear the sky burning, we fear our own cleverness. We fear children becoming something their parents cannot understand. We fear gifts that turn out to be traps. So similarity alone is not proof. But similarity can be a candle. It can show us the shape of a room. The source begins to widen the circle with Atlantis, perhaps the most famous drowned civilization in the Western imagination. Plato tells the story as something received from Egyptian priests, a memory older than Greece, older than the storytellers who shaped it into philosophy. Atlantis, in that account, is not merely a rich island. It is founded through a union between a god and a mortal woman. Poseidon loves Cleito, and from their line comes a royal house with divine blood in it. At first, the Atlanteans are magnificent. They build rings of water and land. They raise temples and palaces. They command ships. They gather metals, animals, crops, wealth, and tribute. The island glitters with order and abundance. It is not hard to imagine it at sunset. Canals shining like bronze ribbons, towers reflected in still water, priests moving through courtyards, horses stamping in white dust, the sea beyond the outer walls breathing against the harbor stones. Then the blood changes. Plato says the divine portion within them weakens as it is mixed again and again with mortal nature. The human element gains power. Greed rises. Ambition grows heavy. The civilization that began with beauty becomes imperial, hungry, swollen with its own strength. Zeus sees this decline and gathers the gods to decide what must be done. The dialogue breaks before the full judgment is spoken, which is almost too perfect for a sleep story. The ancient page opens its mouth, then falls silent. Yet later memory knows the ending. Atlantis is destroyed in a single day and night. Earth shakes. Water rises. The island sinks beneath the sea. Divine human mingling. A powerful civilization. Corruption. Catastrophic erasure. The pattern is familiar. Now move eastward, softly, across desert and river, into Mesopotamia, where the Atrahasis epic remembers a different flood. In that older tale, humans are created to bear labor for the gods. They dig, carry, work, multiply. They become numerous. They become noisy. The gods are disturbed by the noise, and the great flood comes as part of the answer. At first, noise sounds almost funny. Too many humans keeping the gods awake. Like bad neighbors upstairs moving furniture at midnight. I admit, there is something almost domestic about it. Even the gods, apparently, were not immune to needing a little quiet. But the word for noise may carry more than sound. It can suggest uproar, disorder, rebellion, a creation no longer staying within its assigned place. The world becomes too crowded with human force. The boundaries of labor, obedience, reproduction, and divine control begin to strain. After the flood, limitations are introduced. Mortality, barrenness, infant loss, social boundaries, all the hard breaks placed upon a species that had multiplied too freely. Again, we find the same deep anxiety. Creation must be limited so it does not overflow its intended form. The Mayan Popol Vuh carries the pattern in another language of sacred imagination. The makers attempt to create human beings more than once. The first beings fail. The wooden people move and speak, but they have no proper heart, no gratitude, no memory of the divine. They are destroyed, and even the tools and animals turn against them, as if the whole household of creation rejects a failed version of humanity. Then come the people of maize. These are closer to success, but at first, they are too complete. They can see too far. They can understand too much. Their sight reaches across the world. The gods worry that beings with such vision may become too much like the makers themselves. So their sight is clouded. Their perception is narrowed. They become human in the way we know humanity. Gifted, but limited. Awake, but not all-seeing. This is a gentler version of the same old boundary. Do not know too much. Do not become too much. Do not step fully into the place of the gods. Across distant traditions, the same warning appears in different masks. Knowledge can arrive as blessing, but also as burden. Fire can be sacred, but it can also leave the earth barren. Weapons, in epic memory, are sometimes more than sharp metal. They are called down, invoked, unleashed, and afterward, the land itself seems to remember them. Whether these are metaphors, memories, or poems of fear, the moral shape is clear. There are powers that should not be used lightly. That is why these cross-cultural echoes matter to the source. They do not have to be identical to Sodom. They only have to rhyme. Atlantis sinks after divine blood decays into human greed. The flood comes when human life overgrows its intended bounds. The Mayan creators dim the sight of beings who can see too far. Divine weapons scorch the earth when powers beyond measure are released. Sodom burns when a city tries to cross a boundary with beings from outside the human order. The rhyme is quiet, but persist. In each case, humanity, or a human-like civilization, receives, steals, inherits, or breeds towards something beyond its proper measure. Then catastrophe restores the boundary. This is the old fear beneath the old stories. Not merely that humans are wicked, that humans are porous. That we can be entered by powers, taught by powers, altered by powers, tempted to become more than ourselves before we have become good enough to remain ourselves. It is a humbling thought. Around the fire, it should not make us panic. It should make us lower our voices. Because every civilization tells itself that it is different. Sodom surely did. Atlantis did. The builders before the flood did. Every city with bright gates and full granaries thinks tomorrow has already agreed to arrive. Every powerful people thinks its walls are thick enough, its gods favorable enough, its knowledge safe enough. Then a crack appears where no one expected one. Sometimes in the sky, sometimes under the sea, sometimes in the blood, sometimes in the heart. Return now to the watchers, because their gift is the thread that binds much of this source together. In Enoch, They do not simply descend and desire. They teach. Azazel teaches weapons and adornment. Others teach roots, plants, stars, signs, and the paths of heaven. It sounds like the birth of civilization in a dark mirror. The arts that make human life powerful arrive, but stained by their source. A knife can carve bread or harm the hand that holds it. A star chart can guide a traveler or feed the pride of a king. Knowledge of roots can heal fever, or reach too eagerly toward the living pattern beneath visible life. The problem is not always the tool. The problem is the hand, the timing, the hunger behind it. That is why Sodom becomes more than a wicked city in this telling. It becomes a place where hunger learned ceremony, where desire learned law, where exploitation wore the robes of civic order, where wealth sat comfortably beside cruelty, where, perhaps, older forbidden knowledge survived in private chambers while public courts punished the stranger. The men at Lot Door are not described as confused. They are not surprised by the demand they make. They gather as if the city knows what it wants. That image returns again and again because it is the hinge of the story. A whole city at night, surrounding one house, asking for beings who came from outside. The house is small. The crowd is large. The door is the boundary. Inside, the visitors are calm. Outside, the city speaks with one voice. Bring them out, that we may know them. In the source reading, this is the moment Sodom reveals itself. Not in a private sin, not in one hidden act, but in public appetite. It wants what should remain beyond it. It wants to cross the line again. And once the line is crossed enough times, the response comes. Fire. Salt. Silence. Yet the story of Sodom is not only about the past. That is why it still unsettles. If it were only an ancient city behaving badly, we could nod, feel superior, and go to sleep peacefully. But the tale keeps asking questions that reach forward. What knowledge do we seek before we have wisdom? What boundaries do we call outdated because they inconvenience ambition? What do we invite into the house because it appears useful, beautiful, profitable, or powerful? The old story answers in images rather than lectures. A fertile valley becomes salt. A city becomes absence. A woman looking back becomes a pillar. A survivor hides in a cave. A black layer waits under dust for modern hands to find it. That is enough. The ancient world did not need our machines to understand that certain powers leave residue. A curse in old language. Contamination in modern language. Abanan ritual language. Fallout in scientific language. Different tongues. Same shiver. The sense that what has been unleashed does not politely end when the flash is over. The Dead Sea, in this telling, is not scenery. It is testimony. It lies at the bottom of the rift like a bowl into which memory has drained. The water is bright under sun, dark under stars, heavy with minerals, unfriendly to the ordinary business of life. The shore is white. The air is dry. The mountains stand bare. A place once described as well-watered and garden-like is remembered as dead water. That transformation is the final argument of the landscape. Not a sentence written in ink, but a sentence written in salt. Something happened. Something complete. Something that the memory of many cultures helps us imagine, even if we cannot prove its full meaning. Now, as the fire beside us lowers a little, let all those stories rest together. Atlantis under its water, Atrahasis in his boat, the wooden people of the Popol Vuh fading into forest, the watchers descending with knowledge in their hands, Lot at the door, the crowd in the street, the sky above the plain, the clay tablets in the archive, the archaeologist brushing a glassy shard from the dirt. The same motif returns, soft but relentless. A boundary crossed, a warning ignored, a world corrected. And yet, the correction is never perfectly clean. That may be the saddest part. The flood leaves survivors. Sodom leaves Lot and his daughters. The banned cities leave stories. Forbidden knowledge leaves echoes. A wound in the earth becomes a road for travelers. A moral warning becomes a scholarly debate. Nothing vanishes completely. Even erasure leaves a shape. Perhaps that is why the ancient writers told the story at all. Not to let us master it, to let us feel the edge of it. There are things the human mind can approach only by candlelight. Too much brightness makes them crude. Too much certainty makes them false. So the story comes to us as a sequence of images. Visitors at dusk. A closed door. Shrinking numbers. Fire from above. Salt behind. Dead water below. Clay names in a broken archive. A silence where a city used to be. The source says that silence may not be empty. It may be the sound of containment still holding. And if we listen closely, under the crackle of the fire, under the slow breathing of the room, under the old names and the disputed evidence and the myths that rhyme across continents, we may hear the deeper warning. Humanity is not only judged for what it does, it is endangered by what it becomes. So the story keeps its darkness, but it also gives a strange comfort. The world, in these ancient memories, is not abandoned to corruption without answer. There is a boundary, even if we do not always see it. There is a limit, even if cities laugh at it. There is a point at which the sky itself says, no farther. That no farther can be terrifying. It can also be a mercy. The candle burns lower. The map folds itself back into shadow. The Dead Sea lies far away beneath its mineral skin. And somewhere in that stillness, the question that began the story remains alive. Not sharp now, not loud, but steady as a coal. Why was Sodom erased so completely? Perhaps because the danger was not only in the streets. Perhaps it had entered the roots. And when the roots are poisoned, the fire does not come only for the leaves. Now, let the map open one last time. Wider than Canaan. Wider than the Dead Sea. Wider than the hills where Abraham once stood and looked down toward a green plain that would later become a warning. The old world is full of drowned places. Some lie underwater in stories. Some lie under sand. Some lie under the polite language of scholars who prefer safe explanations, which is understandable, because safe explanations let the mind sleep with the door unlocked. But the source keeps asking us to notice that many ancient peoples remembered a similar shape of disaster. Not the same names, not the same gods, not the same rivers. The shape. A people becomes too powerful. A boundary is crossed. A gift becomes poison. A city or a world is corrected by catastrophe. We have already walked past some of these echoes, but now let us slow down and stand among them as if we are in a museum after closing. Imagine the galleries dark, except for a few pools of amber light. The marble floors hold the faint sound of our footsteps. Glass cases sleep on either side. Behind one pane, a clay tablet. Behind another, a carved stone. Farther on, a painted vessel showing a flood, a god, a serpent, a city sinking beneath stylized waves. The labels are neat. The objects are not. The first gallery belongs to Atlantis. It is easy to make Atlantis feel theatrical. All shining towers and blue water and mysterious crystals. The sort of thing people argue about in documentaries with too much dramatic music. But if we listen to Plato softly, the story is more sorrowful than flashy. It begins with a god and a mortal woman, Poseidon and Cleito, a union across kinds. From that union comes a royal line, part divine, part human, strong enough to build a civilization of rings, canals, walls, temples, harbors, and power. For a while, Atlantis is beautiful. That is important. The dangerous city is not always ugly. Sometimes it gleams. Sometimes its streets are swept. Sometimes its mathematics are elegant, and its music is sweet, and its markets are full of fruit. Sometimes ruin approaches a place not because it is crude, but because it is magnificent and has begun to worship its own magnificence. Over generations, Plato says, the divine portion fades, and the mortal nature grows stronger. The rulers become greedy. They stretch outward. They desire possession. They become less like guardians and more like conquerors. Then Zeus sees their condition and gathers the gods. The old text breaks there. I have always found that break more haunting than a full description. The sentence stops with the gods gathered to decide. It leaves us in the room before judgment, listening to silence where the verdict should be. Later, tradition supplies the end. A single day and night of terror. The island gone beneath the sea. Water closes over the shining city. The next gallery is Mesopotamia. Here the light falls on tablets from a world of reeds, mud brick, canals, and temple towers. The Atrahasis story is older than many later flood tellings, and it remembers humanity as a labor force created to relieve the gods. Humans work, multiply, and become noisy. The god Enlil is disturbed by their clamor, and disasters are sent to reduce them. Plague, drought, famine, then flood. Noise sounds small at first, almost comic. Too many humans making too much racket, like a village festival that forgot to end. But in the old language, noise can mean uproar, disorder, the sound of creation slipping out of its assigned rhythm. The gods are not merely annoyed. They are alarmed. Humanity is growing beyond measure. The created servant is becoming a force. After the flood, limits are placed upon human life. Mortality, infertility, loss, boundaries in birth and time. It is a grim kind of mercy, but still a pattern. The world is not allowed to expand without restraint. Life must be narrowed so it can continue. Now the museum turns, and we walk into the Mayan world. The Popol Vuh remembers makers trying again and again to form humanity. Mud people fail. Wooden people move, speak, multiply, but lack heart, memory, and reverence. They are destroyed, and the world itself turns against them. Their tools, their animals, the things they used without gratitude, all become witnesses against them. Then come the people of maize. These first people are almost too perfect. Their sight reaches far. They understand too much. They can see across the world, across hidden distances, across the whole shape of things. The makers grow concerned. If these beings see as gods see, what will remain between creature and creator? So their vision is clouded. Their perception is softened. The human condition begins with a veil. That is such a tender and frightening idea. To be human is not only to know. It is to be spared from knowing everything. The source places that beside Sodom, and the rhyme becomes clearer. In Sodom, the city wants to know what it should not know. The crowd at the door wants access to visitors who do not belong to the ordinary human order. In the Mayan story, the gods prevent human sight from reaching too far. In both, there is a boundary around knowledge. Not every door should open. Not every visitor should be seized. Not every kind of sight is safe. Another gallery glows with Indian epic memory. There are weapons in those traditions described not as simple blades or arrows, but as powers invoked, powers called down, powers that burn, blend, poison, and leave aftermaths that sound strangely modern to our ears. The source mentions the Brahmastra, a divine weapon remembered as capable of destroying armies or cities, leaving water unsafe, bodies weakened, generations troubled after the flash. We do not need to claim that ancient poets were describing modern machines. That would be too easy, and perhaps too eager. But the image remains powerful, a weapon from above or beyond ordinary war, a force that does not stop when the light fades, a land marked afterward. Again, the rhyme. A power too great for common hands. A release of heat. A poisoned place. A memory that becomes sacred warning. Now let the museum fall away. Let the objects return to shadow. Let the glass cases fade. Let us stand again by the Dead Sea, under a moon so pale it makes the salt look like old bone. The water is still, not peaceful exactly, more like a sealed jar. The cliffs hold their breath. The shore crunches softly underfoot. If you were standing here with me, you might speak more quietly without knowing why. This is where the source gathers the threads. Atlanti, a divine human line that grows corrupt and sinks. Atrahasis, a human world that multiplies beyond order and is drowned. The Popolvu, beings whose sight must be dimmed because they see too far. Enoch, watchers who teach forbidden arts and produce forbidden offspring. Chana'an, giant clans remembered in territories marked for cleansing. Sodom, a city that tries to know strange flesh and is erased by fire and salt. None of these stories proves the others, but together they make a pattern old enough to trouble the sleep of kings. Ancient people seem to have feared that humanity could be altered from the outside. Not only tempted, altered, taught too fast, armed too early, bred into something unstable, given vision without wisdom, technique without reverence, appetite without boundary. That fear is not childish. It is deeply adult. Every age faces it in its own language. The old world spoke of watchers, gauze, divine weapons, giant, curses, and forbidden knowledge. A later age speaks of systems, experiments, technologies, engineered life, weapons beyond recall, powers released into the world before the heart is ready to hold them. The words change. The shiver remains. This is why the story of Sodom still breathes. If it were only about a wicked city long ago, it would be small. It would be a cautionary tale with ancient dust on it. But if Sodom is about the crossing of limits, then it never quite ends. It waits wherever a civilization says, "We can do this, therefore we should." It waits wherever a people mistakes ability for permission. It waits at every door where something not fully understood is invited in because it promises power. And still, we must be fair. Perhaps Sodom was only a city ruined by a cosmic accident. Perhaps the airburst theory, if correct, explains the whole thing without angels or watchers or forbidden bloodlines. Perhaps the ancient memory of guilt was woven around disaster afterward, because survivors needed the sky to have a reason. Perhaps the names in the Ebla tablets are coincidental. Perhaps Tal el Hammam is not Sodom. Perhaps the salt and the fire and the blackened layer belong to history, while the darker interpretation belongs to myth. That may be true, but even then, myth is not empty. Myth is the shape memory takes when facts alone are too small to carry grief. A real blast can become divine fire. A poisoned plane can become a curse. A city destroyed in a day can become a lesson about arrogance, cruelty, and boundaries. The story may grow. Yes, it may gather theology, poetry, fear, and warning. But growth does not mean falsehood. A tree grows around a wound. The wound is still there. So the source does not ask us for certainty. It asks us to sit in the hush between evidence and meaning. The clay tablets do not preach. They simply preserve names. The ruins do not explain. They simply hold the destruction layer. The Dead Sea does not argue. It simply lies there, dense with salt, a basin with no outlet, a mirror that gives back too much light. And the old text does not answer every modern question. It gives us Abraham counting down from 50 to 10. It gives us Lot at the gate. It gives us the crowd at the door. It gives us angels who say, "Hurry." It gives us fire from heaven. It gives us a woman of salt. That is enough to keep the mind awake for a while. But remember, this is still a sleep story. Not because the subject is gentle, but because the telling can be gentle. We do not need to solve every ancient dread before morning. We can let the fragments rest beside one another. A tablet, a shard, a salt pillar, a flood myth, a drowned island, a giant bed, a closed door, a sky brightening before dawn. The pieces are not a cage. They are a constellation. We look up, connect them softly, and see a shape. The shape says, "Be careful with gifts from beyond the proper boundary. Be careful with knowledge that flatters the hand but darkens the heart. Be careful with cities that become rich enough to stop hearing the poor. Be careful with desire that calls itself curiosity. Be careful with doors, especially the doors that open at night. And now, as the fire lowers, imagine the ancient world settling around us like a blanket of dust. The scribes are gone. The kings are gone. The merchants have closed their ledgers. The cities of the plain no longer send goods along the road. The watchers, if they were ever here, have withdrawn into the difficult silence above the stars. The Dead Sea remains, keeping its mineral vigil. The next movement of the story is not outward anymore. It is inward, back to the plain, back to one possible reconstruction, back to the final night when the visitors arrived. The city gathered, the door closed, and something above the sleeping valley began to move toward fire. Let us return, very softly, to the final night, not as judges, not as people holding a lamp too close to a wound, only as listeners, sitting near the edge of an ancient plain while the stars watch from above and the city below still believes in morning. Sodom is alive. That is the first thing to remember. Before, it is a symbol. Before it is a ruin. Before it becomes a word people use to frighten one another. It is alive. Lamps burn in houses. Oil pools in shallow bowls. Bread cools beneath cloth. A child turns in sleep. A trader counts what he owes and frowns at a tablet. A woman folds a garment and pauses because she thinks she has heard voices outside. Somewhere near the gate, men speak in low tones. Somewhere in the city, a dog lifts its head and listens. The end of a place is more sorrowful when we remember that it had ordinary evenings. The visitors enter at dusk. Lot sees them, and his body understands danger before the story explains it. He rises. He bows. He urges them toward his house. His words are polite, but beneath them runs fear. Do not stay in the square. Not here. Not tonight. Perhaps not ever. They enter. Feet are washed. Bread is prepared. The small rituals of hospitality unfold in a room where everyone must feel the tension thickening. The walls are clay. The lamp flame is modest. Shadows gather in corners. Outside, the city becomes aware of what has arrived. Then, footsteps. At first, maybe only a few. Then more. A murmur at the street mouth. A shifting crowd. Voices gathering, not like rain, more like a rope being pulled tight. The text says young and old, from every quarter. The city is not sleeping now. It is assembling. Bring them out, that we may know them. There it is again. The old word. The dangerous word. No. In another story, knowledge is fruit. In another, it is sight. In Enoch, it is taught by watchers. In Sodom, it stands outside a door and demands entry. Knowledge without reverence. Curiosity without humility. Desire without boundary. Lot steps out and closes the door behind him. That small motion may be the last faithful thing he does for the city. A man placing his body between the mob and the guests. A man who has compromised too long, perhaps, but not so completely that he cannot still recognize a line when he is standing on it. The crowd presses. The visitors reach out. Lot is pulled inside. The door closes. Blindness falls. The men outside search for the entrance and cannot find it. This image feels almost merciful in its terror. They are stopped without being destroyed. For one final moment, the door is still there, but they cannot see it. The boundary they wanted to cross has become invisible to them. They are left with only their hunger and their hands. Inside, the verdict has already arrived. Leave. Take your family. Do not remain. Do not look back. Lot goes to his future sons-in-law. They laugh. That laughter is one of the saddest sounds in the whole story. Not loud laughter, perhaps. Not cruel laughter, necessarily. The little disbelief of men who think the world cannot end before breakfast. They have plans. They have names. They have arrangements. They have the great foolish confidence of people who live inside walls. So they stay. Just before dawn, the angels take Lot and his family by the hand. The mercy is physical, not a speech, a grip, not an argument, a pull. The city slips behind them street by street, house by house, memory by memory. Perhaps Lot looks once at the gate where he used to sit. Perhaps he does not dare. Perhaps his wife hears the faint sound of something falling in a room she will never enter again. They reach the edge of the plain. The sky brightens. And then the old world changes. Fire from heaven. Sulfur. A force from above. The source asks us to imagine not a campfire grown large, but an event that alters matter. Heat that can glaze clay. Pressure that can shock stone. Salt lifted, scattered, driven into soil. A blast so complete that the plain itself becomes part of the sentence. Whether one calls it divine judgment, cosmic airburst, targeted fire, sacred weapon, or disaster remembered through theology, the image remains the same. The city is overturned. The growing things are gone. The place becomes a scar. Lot's wife turns back. For one breath, she belongs to both directions. Ahead, survival. Behind, home. Ahead, the hard unknown. Behind, children of memory, bowls, rooms, streets, neighbors, the whole life that made her herself. Then the story fixes her in salt. A pilar. A warning. A grief. We can let her be more than disobedience. We can let her be human. Sometimes the past calls so strongly that even salvation feels like abandonment. She looks back, and the landscape keeps her. Lot and his daughters continue. The smoke rises. The plain falls silent. From there, the story moves into aftermath, which is where many stories become more honest. The spectacle is over. The survival begins. Lot hides in a cave. His daughters, shaken by what they have seen, believe the world has emptied. In fear and confusion, they try to preserve a line. From that cave come nations that will stand in uneasy relation to Israel. The destruction was complete, and yet not complete. Fire can erase a city. It cannot erase consequence. That is the haunting truth. No catastrophe ends where it happens. It enters names, children, borders, songs, warnings, laws, and dreams. It changes how people speak of strangers. It changes how they read the sky. It changes what they fear in bloodlines, marriages, cities, and gifts from beyond. Sodom burns once in the story, but after that it burns in memory for thousands of years. And memory, like salt, preserves. Now gather every thread one final time. The Ebla tablets, ordinary clay, ordinary trade, possible names of extraordinary cities. We keep the caution. We know the debate. Still, those names feel like footsteps under dust. The Genesis account, brief and severe, gives us Abraham bargaining down to 10, Lot at the gate, angels at dusk, the crowd at the door, fire from heaven, salt behind. Ezekiel gives us pride, abundance, ease, and neglect of the poor, a city rich enough to become cruel. Jude gives us strange flesh, a phrase that opens a darker corridor. Enoch gives us watchers, forbidden knowledge, hybrid offspring, the old fear that the created order can be crossed and corrupted. Jasher gives us a Sodom of legal cruelty, hospitality turned inside out. The stranger punished for being vulnerable. Archaeology gives us the possibility of a real catastrophe in the plain, a destruction layer, heat, glass, salt, and sudden abandonment. Not certainty, but enough to make the old tale feel less like smoke and more like smoke rising from an actual fire. The Dead Sea gives us the final image. Water that does not nourish. Salt that shines. A basin below the world, receiving rivers and returning only evaporation. A place that seems to say, something was stopped here. That is the focus of the whole story. Not merely why Sodom was punished, why it was erased. Erasure is different. Erasure is what happens when rebuilding is not allowed. When the ground itself is made to remember. When the warning is written not on a tablet, but into water, mineral, shore, and silence. If the source is right, Sodom was not only a city of arrogance and cruelty, it was a place where an older danger had taken root, a place where the pre-flood wound reopened, a place where the boundary between human and other was being pressed again. The visitors came to see. The city revealed itself. The fire came down. If the source is wrong in its darkest reading, the story still holds. Sodom remains a warning about wealth without mercy, appetite without reverence, knowledge without humility, and cities that forget the poor at their gates. Even without watchers, even without strange bloodlines, even without targeted fire, the tale has enough darkness to be true in the way old stories are true. A city can die from what it worships. A people can become so certain of tomorrow that they cannot hear the warning at the door. A land can remember what its inhabitants tried to forget. And perhaps that is why the story belongs beside a fireplace at night. Not because we want fear, but because fear, held gently, can become wisdom. The darkness outside the window is not our enemy when the candle is lit. It simply reminds us that the world is larger than our room, older than our questions, and deeper than our explanations. Listen now to the quiet after the telling. The archive in Rome has gone still. The plaster casts rest in their drawers. The photographs lie flat under careful light. The scholars have closed their books for the evening, leaving clay names to sleep in silence. Far away, the mound of Tal el Hammam rests under stars. The trenches are covered. The tools are put away. The glassy shards do not glow. They simply wait, as all evidence waits, for patient hands and humbler questions. Farther still, the Dead Sea lies below the living world. Moonlight touches it. No fish disturb the surface. No reeds whisper along the shore. Salt gathers in pale crusts, beautiful and barren. The cliffs stand guard. The air is dry. The silence is almost complete. Almost, because stories are a kind of sound, very soft, very old. They move through time the way water moves through stone, slowly, secretly, changing the shape of what receives them. The story of Sodom has moved through law, prophecy, sermon, argument, excavation, speculation, fear, and wonder. It has been misused, simplified, sharpened, softened, dismissed, revived. And still, beneath all of that, one quiet question remains. What happened there? Maybe a city was judged. Maybe a danger was contained. Maybe a cosmic stone burst above a valley and human memory wrapped the wound in sacred language. Maybe the truth is stranger than any single answer. Tonight, we do not need to force it. We can leave Abraham under the oaks. We can leave Lot on the road. We can leave his wife where the story leaves her, white and still, facing what she could not release. We can leave the angels moving away from the plain, their work finished, their faces unreadable. We can leave the city beneath ash. the water beneath salt, the tablets beneath dust. And we can come back to this room. The fire is low now. The candle has shortened. The old names are fading into the walls. Sodom, Gomorrah, Adma, Zeboim, Zoar. Say them softly, and they sound less like places than like stones dropped into deep water. Each name makes a ring. The rings widen. Then the surface calms again. There is comfort in not knowing everything. There is mercy in limits. There is rest in letting the ancient world keep some of its secrets until morning. So breathe once, slowly, not because the story commands it, but because the night has become quiet enough to notice. Let the salt shore fade. Let the clay tablets darken. Let the ruined gates close gently in the mind. Let the river move downward through the valley, carrying memory toward the silent sea. The question remains, but it no longer needs to keep watch over you. The scar remains, but far away. The fire remains, but only here, small and warm, held safely in the hearth. Good night.